All right, good morning and welcome to Happy Hour. It is November 13th, and I'm Eileen Cook, and we are here to talk all things writing related. So I'm going to apologize off the bat because my dogs are insane today. I don't know. It predates the bird on the window incident. They somehow knew I had a radio interview this morning and picked today of all days to be just a little crazy. So I don't know if you can see or hear them in the background, but they're dancing back and forth, trying to drive me crazy. So this conversation comes up today because of actually an email that I got from Shalon, who couldn't be here, but I imagine she's going to listen to this later. So we will talk nicely about her, as we would anyway. But she basically was telling me about what she felt like she got her money out of the Surrey conference with. And what really worked for her is that she had a pitch session with Don Moss. And he said, I'm going to just read part of her email. He loved the concept of my book. He thought the title was perfect, the writing flawless, very nice. The voice was strong. But he said the character's reaction to the inciting incident was predictable. He asked that I edit those few pages and surprise him and send it along. So she kind of wrote that she sort of felt like that was basically everything that she needed to learn all in one happy little tiny blue pencil pitch session. So she got it all typed up. So she started referencing, Don has a book called Writing 21st Century Fiction, and he has a whole section on surprise. But I think it's kind of interesting for us to talk about, because I think when we think of surprise, we think of like, oh, you know, something jumping out at you kind of thing. And that's not always what it is. For example, it might be me beating my dogs, which is going to happen at a minute of time. So I think the first thing to know is that we read because we kind of want to experience what it's like to be in someone else's shoes. I think that's a big part of what draws us in. So I think if they do exactly what we would do, or if nothing is shocking or surprising about that, it gets dull. So element of surprise is basically when something happens in your story which the reader would consider to be unexpected. So, you know, kind of what do we think about that is backing up to try and figure out how I want to explain this. Can you tell this is a new concept for me too, that I'm working it out? What does we work it out together? So basically we talk about things that are static. So life isn't static. So that is, things are constantly happening all the time. So things are very rarely in a straight line. They're very A to B. That's not the way life works. Like, you often have an A to B plan. It's just that life often will take you in a completely and totally random different direction. And I think that is why it's somewhat interesting to us to see what those things are going to happen. So kind of what you expect is not always there. So I think one of the things to think about is actually even just in terms of driving. So if you're driving a car, cruising along, has anyone ever had the experience, show of hands, where you've actually gotten to work or the grocery store or whatever, and you actually have no recollection of getting there? Like, it was almost like you slept through the entire experience. Like, you know, you had to have been awake, but you have no actual memory of that instance. And that is because nothing actually happened to draw your attention. And if you think about what you're actually doing, you're actually operating a several ton heavy thing that can, you know, swipe out people with a moment's notice. It's got all this stuff going on, but you're almost not even paying attention to it. You're at the same time, you're listening to an audiobook, you're taking a quick cell call from somebody, you're looking around, but all these things are happening and you're not necessarily noticing what's happening around you because everything is as you expect it to be. Just a brief moment to yell at a dog there and we're good. All right. So everything is kind of as you expect it to be. But the instant that the person in front of you slams on their brakes, especially if you weren't expecting that to happen, your brain instantly goes, holy shit, all your focus switches, you pay instant attention to what's happening in front of you. You're not still listening to your audiobook. You're not still like taking a notice of like, oh, hey, that's different. I hadn't seen that. Like, instantly your brain will focus in on that. That's what you want to have happening in your stories. You want to be careful that you're not driving your characters on a place that they feel like they know, where they almost kind of zone out. Because if they're zoning out, that's not good. So I don't know how many people saw, I put a link to a Pixar Writing Outside the Box course in GLIP. And I will find it and post it in the show notes for this one as well, so people have it. I just stumbled across it when I was actually looking at this topic and doing some different things. But Pixar uses the element of surprise a lot in their stories. So it's things that they're doing that might sort of be an unexpected reaction to something. This doesn't mean that something has to jump out at you. It doesn't mean someone has to slam on the brakes, but that something you're not expecting shows up and it will draw your attention. So if you're at the bus stop and you're watching people go by back and forth, and somebody walks by, as recently happened to me, a group of tiny ballerinas walked by. So I was guessed they were like junior high age, and I think they must have been going from, there must be a dance studio near the coffee shop I was at. And where they were going, but I was looking up and I was doing something on my laptop, and I looked up and it caught my eye, and there's this like tiny little group of ballerinas that just strolled past and then went by. Lots of other people had walked by, and it hadn't drawn my attention, but because I didn't expect to see ballerinas complete with tutus, it drew my attention instantly. I think you see this happen in shows a lot of times, that what attracts our attention is something we didn't expect. Game of Thrones is a prime example. So spoiler alert, if you haven't watched Game of Thrones by now, really I can't help you. So you're just going to have to listen to some spoiler alerts. The show starts off with Ned Stark, right? And you really believe that he's going to be the hero of this show. Right? So he's coming in, he's doing all these heroic kind of things. He looks pretty good. Sean Bean's not a bad looking dude, right? And then they kill him. And was anyone else just totally like, or people who remember the Red Wedding, if anyone remembers that scene where, like, honestly, where I sat up on the sofa and I was like, that did not just happen. Can anyone else think of some TV show or movie that they thought where something just totally came out of no one, where you were just completely shocked? What happened in Get Out, Denise? I didn't see that one.
Oh, it will be a big spoiler alert, but you expect everything to be like a black man with a white woman and that type of racial things going on. But the family is very liberal. They say African American, they're not racist and everything. But then it goes totally out of control. But I don't want to tell it because it will be a big spoiler. You should watch it. It's a really good movie.
All right. It's on my list. I haven't seen it yet. I think that those shows stick with us because we weren't expecting them. Yeah, Sixth Sense, I see ghosts. That was another great example where you were kind of watching the movie, you think you kind of know what's happening, and all of a sudden there's a moment where you're like, I did not see that coming. Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, definitely when she gets her revenge. Like, you think there are certain things that are safe, and when the author or the showrunner or the actors pull that away from you, it instantly makes your attention rivet back to that moment. The other one, I'm not certain people have seen, since we've been talking about dead things, have seen Dead to Me on Netflix. So the basic premise of this, and I'm not spoilering anything here, is a woman whose husband has been killed in a hit and run accident meets another woman in this grief support group. You find out in the first episode that the person she meets in the grief support group is actually the person who hit her husband, who is like, yeah, Kristen's face was like, what? So she has no idea. The woman who hit her husband is racked with guilt. That's partially why she joined this group, is to kind of try and make amends, but she hasn't figured out what to say. And of course, if she admits that she was in the car that hit this woman, she'll go to jail, or this guy, she'll go to jail. So but they're becoming friends. Like, they're becoming actually close friends. And there is a scene where she is trying to get over the fact that she's lost her husband, and she's read about this idea. So she and all of her boys and her new best friend all sit down to write a message to to the dearly departed husband. So you actually see the woman who hit him write the thing like, I am so sorry, I'm the one who killed you. And then they roll up the messages and they put them in helium balloons and they set them free. And it's the idea, we're sending our messages off to this person. So the very next scene is Christina Applegate, who's the main character, the wife, sitting by the pool. She's crying a little bit. She's still mourning the loss of her husband. And you see one of the balloons slowly losing altitude and drifting back in. And as the watcher, you are 100% convinced this is the balloon that has the message saying, I'm so sorry, I killed you. And you see it slowly drift out in front of her, and you're like, that's what's going to happen. She takes the balloon, she pops it. You see her read the message, and then you realize it's actually just her message from her son. So it's a message from her son that says, Dad, I really miss playing video games with you. So you have this buildup where you think this thing is going to happen, and then there's a moment of surprise, or again, I would use the term unexpected. You're so conditioned to assume that that's the thing that's going to happen, that when it doesn't happen, it instantly draws your attention. Now I'm going to give the showrunners of that some extra kudos, because although the message feels like it's a letdown, it actually leads her to a huge plot point. Because she decides to play video games with her son, she finds out a piece of information about her husband that she certainly was not expecting. So if you haven't seen Dead to Me, it's about 10 episodes on Netflix. I would encourage it because I do think it's really well written in terms of playing with those unexpected things. I expected that the person she met, I actually saw that reveal coming, that the woman she met at the grief group was going to be the person who hit her husband. There was just a few clues, and I felt very clever. I was like, oh, I'd figured it out. But then they gave that away in the first episode. So then I was like, oh, okay, I thought that's what the show was going to be about. And then they take it in a very unexpected way. And so that's what I enjoyed about it. So I think you can do kind of an unexpected reveal or surprise, either in a big way, in a Game of Thrones kind of way, where it's like, holy cow, Red Wedding, or Ned Stark's dead. Or you can do it in an unexpected way, in a small way, in terms of, oh, this is how this person's going to respond, or of course, this is what's going to happen next. Oh, of course, she's going to go downstairs and see him kissing this person. That's what happens in all of these stories. And that's why I think it's so useful to know your tropes and what happens in things that you like, because you can start to play those things. So you can think about what is unexpected. So you don't want stuff to be basically static. So you're thinking about how you can kind of change those up and make something unexpected happen. All right, so hang on, I'm looking through for one of my notes. So for other people, questions or thoughts about surprise? You're all quiet. All right. So how would you do that? Anyone? What is your suggestion? How would you have something unexpected? Bonnie?
I was actually just going to say that in questions. Is it all about the setup? You set up expectations. You lead the reader in a certain way, often using tropes, and then you don't do that.
So, and in fact, there's an element, if you watch those Pixar videos, they talk about the joke. And so the example that they give in one of the videos is, a mushroom walks into a bar. People seen this one yet? Mushroom walks into the bar. It sees a beautiful woman dancing. It goes up and it says, hey, baby, would you like to dance? And she's like, oh, gross, you're a mushroom. No way. So he goes over to another woman and he says, hey, Christy, you look pretty good. You want to hit the dance floor? And Christy's like, oh, my God, no way. And then over and over, he's asking, and no one is interested in dancing. And suddenly he sits down and he says to the bartender, I don't get it. I don't know why anyone doesn't want to dance with me. I'm a really fun guy. Get it? Get it? Some of you are laughing. Some of you look very angry at me. I'm not saying it's a great joke. I'm saying that the setup is there. And so they talk in the Pixar video that you have to tell that in order. So if you tell it out of order, if you say, a mushroom who thinks of himself as a fungi goes into a bar, then it's no longer what works is that you're not expecting it, and there's that tiny little twist or the play on words at the end that works as the joke. So you have to set it up in a particular way for it to work. That's very true with humor, but it's also true with any kind of unexpected thing. Anyone else, how would you get the element of something unexpected in your story? Anyone want to weigh in? Jenny.
This is more about like, and this actually comes from a Don Moss workshop, but it's one of the things that's stuck with me over the years, is when you're trying to decide on a character reaction or an action or something, start brainstorming and make a list and write down like the first, the second, the third, the 10th, the 12th, the 15th. And those things at the end of the list, the things that you really had to struggle to think of, those are the things that are going to be surprising to everybody else as well.
And I think that is bang on one of the biggest things that you can do, which is to push yourself. Because let's say we have a character. So we have Eileen, who is going on the dating scene for the first time in a long time. And she goes out to the bar, and she walks into the bar, and she sees an attractive guy at the bar. So what is she going to do? So you kind of like, you're like, oh, well, she's going to go up and talk to the guy, or she's going to walk out of the bar. Like the first couple of things that you think of are probably the first couple of things that everybody else is thinking of. So being like, okay, well, what else could she do? Like, what is something? And again, I think you want to push yourself to kind of see what those things are. And Cynthia put in the chat, which I think is really useful, is how might your character respond? And then is there some way to have them do the opposite? So eventually you have to go, like it actually, like you could have be like, Eileen puts on a chicken suit and begins to strut around the bar. Like that would be unexpected, but it would also just be really, really weird. So unless you've set up that I have some significant issues, which you might have been able to set up, it's not going to read as right. It's going to read as too bizarre. So it has to be something that might be a little bit different. So again, you're trying to find that thing that is not quite the same as what somebody might do all the time, but at the same time is somewhat within the realm of possibilities. So I think Don Moss's idea of creating a long list can help. Christy.
I do this sort of thing with my junior architects. So yesterday, our design challenges to create a house for some kind of pet or creature. So they were sort of like, so they're doing stuff that's really normal. I'm like, hey, you guys, you got to think outside the box. So let's just say you've got a fish. So where's the fish going to live? Oh, in a fish bowl. Okay, bigger. Okay, a big fish bowl. Okay. And so, but it was so fun to just start expanding. So then it's like, okay, so well, could the fish live on Mars? Yeah. Okay, so if it lived on Mars, what does its house look like? And so one of the boys is like, well, could I do it in the shape of a trident? Because like that's what Poseidon would be holding. It could live in the trident. And then another guy's like, yeah, but what if I've got a fish and a cat? Like what if I did a cat house that has all these tubes and they wind around and that's got the water in it for the fish? And it was just so amazing to do this, just kind of brainstorming of take something really average, a fish house, and where can you go with that?
So I think those are things where, again, when we go with our first thing. So if someone said to me, if I was in an art class, if I'm in junior architects, first off, what the heck I'm doing in junior architects is a mystery, but assume I'm in there for some reason. And someone says, you're going to build a house for a creature. I think most people are going to be like, okay, dog, cat, horse. Let's give a call out to someone who's like, I'm going to build one for a dragon. Or I'm going to build one, you know, like they start thinking kind of outside of that norm, which makes it interesting. So I think there are a couple of different ways that you can build or look for this. So one is thinking about, can the character say something unexpected? So playing with that idea of maybe a character suddenly says exactly what they're thinking or feeling, which is unusual. So is there a way to have the character speak up in a way that normally they would not, that will catch the reader's eye? And I think part of that comes from, we love a good line. We just often don't think of it in the moment. I'm not sure if people were following on Twitter. Mary Robinette and I were having a fun back and forth because she had posted about how she had met some people at a conference and they were kind of very dismissive of her. And then when they found out, like, oh, you're the Nebula Hugo Award-winning science fiction author, all of a sudden they were really important. And I was giving a true example where someone once said to me, they were talking, and kind of a similar thing, they weren't paying attention, and someone said, oh, you should ask Eileen about that. Her agent's Barbara Powell, and she's with Simon Schuster or whatever. And the person goes, oh, I didn't know you were important. Which is really, like, I was kind of really not sure what to say to that. But I had written back on Twitter, like, what I wish I had said is like, oh, it's okay, I didn't know you were an asshole. So that was the line I wish I had had in the moment, which of course I didn't have in the moment, because you never think of the really good thing in the moment. But the beautiful thing about fiction is there's such a thing as page back. So you can go back when you think of that really great response that's really sharp and very unexpected. You can go back and put that in, and it will catch the reader, because it is that just sort of beautiful moment, whether it's just a perfectly turned phrase or it's unexpected in another way, in terms of, I didn't think you'd actually say that out loud, or that you would admit that out loud, or that's so not like how you are. Any of those kinds of things will kind of lead to that sort of sense of unexpected. So think about what your characters say is really useful. Think about the actual space. So we've talked about setting and those kinds of things. So I do think, I was using the example of the ballerinas earlier, but like, is there something that would be unexpected? So in your physical space, if you guys think about your apartment, is there anything in your apartment you think people would be surprised to find there that you're willing to say aloud? Anything where people would be like, if they came into your space, they would be like, oh, I didn't know you were into this, or I didn't know you liked that, like an interest, like, we might get a live shot of Jenny's. What is that, Jenny? What are we seeing in your space, Jenny? You have to unmute yourself or we can't know.
My cat climbing wall. So I have all these things hanging on the walls that the cats can climb up and sit on and go into.
Of course you do. Of course you do. But I think that tells us a certain thing, or someone who might, like, I'm going to steal something from Christy, but in a backwards way. So a guy was like, oh, I went to Stanford. Like, so you might go to someone's place, like if you went into someone's house who was in a trailer, but they had framed on the wall a certificate from Harvard University, it would make you see them in a new or a different light. We sort of surround ourselves with things that we hope kind of reflect who we are. And it makes us interested in those people. So looking around the physical space and figuring out, is there maybe something unexpected in your character's home or area that would make the reader go like, oh, I didn't think they would be someone who would hang a sword on the wall. That kind of thing. And the interesting, Denise is like, I'm boring. But I'm just like looking behind your space. I'm pretty sure you have board games. Now, I'm not shocked by that, but I'm kind of surprised by that. And it opens up a different part of you than I might know. And someone who might know you from work or from a different element might be really surprised by that. So that's Bonnie's question, like, you don't know how it looks to other people. So kind of for you, it's like, well, that's not bizarre or strange at all. But that might be for someone else, like, oh, that's different or interesting. Like, you guys will not be surprised at all, but I have a little shelf in my desk, which you can't see, which is full of ink, because I have a little bit of a fountain pen addiction. So I have this nice little tidy shelf of ink. And I have had people who have come in and been like, Oh, I would have thought you would, like, for some reason they were sort of surprised to have that come in. And I'm laughing. Rita's talking about the first thing people see is like the amount of books, I'm guessing, on your bookshelf. And kind of also what kind of books you have on your bookshelf, I think is an interesting thing. Marianne, were you going to chime in? Or did I just imagine that in my head? I imagined it in my head. So let's just tell you a map of the world where everywhere you've traveled. Which, yeah, one is maybe surprising because you don't travel as much anymore. But I think it's also maybe surprising to people some places that you would have gone. So for some people, they'll have an idea like, oh, Alyssa's like, she's probably been to like Paris and, you know, Germany and London, but they might be shocked if you've been through the Far East, or like, oh yeah, no, I've totally been to this, you know, place where it would be like, oh, I didn't see that coming. West Africa, for example, would be one, like, I would not say that I saw that coming, and it makes that interesting. So think about like conversations that you have with someone. Is there something that they wear? Is there something that they do that is just unexpected? And also how that changes. So like one of the things that I remember, does anyone remember a few years ago before women, and I'm going to say this, like older women of middle age, started to put wild colors in their hair? Do you remember? Like nobody was doing it. Like it would be something like if you were 19, maybe you would have done it. And then all of a sudden it became kind of a thing. Like if you were kind of a hip, kind of creative type, you would see a woman who might be in her 40s or 50s who'd have a bright purple streak or a bright green streak or whatever. And now it's almost not that unusual, right? Like if you see that, you're not necessarily shocked or surprised in any kind of way. And I remember thinking, because I was sort of intrigued to do it, and I said to my friend who does hair, I was like, I can't do it anymore, because there recently had been an ad on TV for like women's Depends undergarments where the woman had been putting purple in her hair. And I'm like, once it goes to the Depends thing, it's like peak hair color. Like it's already like any chance I had of being edgy is already done over and out of the picture already. Because people are surprised that your first degree is in microbiology. Bonnie people being surprised that she writes teen fiction. Grandma with their orange hair. See, it starts with the Depends, and then they just get this idea they're going to do the wild, crazy hair. Will Gibson writing with the typewriter. We're always, I think, looking for that kind of thing. And if you can spot something in someone that draws your attention. So that's going to be your homework for the next week, is I want you, when you're out and about and you're in a restaurant, like who draws your attention and why? So is it someone who has on an unusual piece of clothing, or they have a particular laugh? I remember once I was at a bar and there was a guy 2 or 3 seats over who was like, like, but he was this huge dude, like huge. And he had this like really tiny, like, and it made me start to laugh because of his laugh. I have been known to have a snorty laugh, where it'll throw some people out. Yeah, I can see, Jane, where people will be like, oh, I wouldn't picture you to be in a sari. Like that's unusual. I didn't expect it. And then it makes me want to know more. Why are you wearing that? What is it about that sort of appeals to you? So we're always kind of looking for those things that might draw your attention. Also think about it in terms of physical space. What kind of things draw your attention? What do you notice when you walk into a room or a space? And I think it's particularly interesting for those people who do like to travel. Like one of the things that we know is when you travel, part of what you like you ever notice like days seem longer when you're on vacation? Like they just feel like Cynthia's like, nope. They feel shorter when they're all over, but they don't feel shorter in the moment. They often feel longer in the moment. And I think part of that is because you're having this experience and you're noticing so many more things than you might not notice if it was in your day-to-day life. So I'm always kind of curious about what it is that catches your attention. it's always very interesting if you go back to a place that you've known really well and you're seeing it and something is new, like, oh, wait a minute, that used to be the grocery store and they've torn it down and they've put something new there. Or the flowers are blooming and they weren't blooming last time that I went by there. Like, it doesn't have to be always a big thing, but it's something that would catch your eye and just make you pay attention. And that's what we're trying to do with the element of surprise. So it's not necessarily, although I'm totally open to a big shock and reveal, what I'm often looking for is that idea that makes people pause and be like, well, wait a minute, let me look at that again. Let me see that again. And I think if you can do that, what you're going to do is to pull the reader's eye and attention on that. Other thoughts where people want to weigh in with surprise or elements? How would you add it to your manuscript? Or can you think of any moments of surprise that you already have? What is something that happens in your book that the reader, you hope, doesn't see coming right off the bat? I'm going to go with Alyssa's. I did not see that the brother would die early on. So the younger brother's like, spoiler alert for those of you guys who haven't read it, the brother's going to get eaten by a lion. I didn't see that coming. And again, like, I think a good surprise is sometimes where you're not necessarily always shocked after you realize it. You're like, okay, I can see it. And it's an organic thing that happens in the plot that makes sense. But I don't think that I thought that would be the outcome of that scene when I went into that scene. So as a result, it pulls me in, and then I'm going to be curious to see how people respond to that. Anyone else think of something that is in their manuscript? Going to be shy? Jenny.
So this is little, but so in the scene I was just working on, so Sarah, my character, is like asleep and she wakes up in the middle of the night and she can't get back to sleep. So she gets up to take a walk and the whole house is under construction, right? So she's walking and there's a full moon and she's kicking up dust. And so it's got this kind of moody feel to it. And she goes around the corner and there's a workman who's like snuck off and fallen asleep on the floor, and he's got an empty bottle of booze and he's sleeping, and she comes around the corner and she's kind of surprised and she goes, what? And he wakes up and he goes, what? And he thinks she's a ghost. So that starts a rumor.
I think that'll work because, again, it doesn't always have to be something where the reader is like, oh my God, but they thought one thing is going to happen, but it twists it. And so Bonnie's saying she's trying to put a twist or surprise in every scene. And I think that's not a bad way to go. But it can be interesting to sort of play with it. So I think things that you can play with. Go ahead, Alyssa.
I think sometimes the obvious happens, but it happens for a reason we don't expect. Or it's like the character motivation isn't quite what we were expecting, and that can be the surprise or the twist.
I love when people have things that are on my next thing. So one of the things I have is things that you can play with that surprise, and the next one on there is motivation. So we see someone do something, we're like, oh yeah, of course that's what they're going to do. But then we uncover and discover, like, oh no, there's a different reason that they did it than I thought that there was. And it makes us see them or react to them in a different way. Denise, you were going to add something in?
Yeah, I'm thinking about my next book's plot. A wife comes from traveling and her husband tells her he wants a divorce. So you expect they have a house and a very, luxurious car. So you expect man get the car and woman get the house. But then surprisingly, she takes the keys and runs with the car.
I think she made a bad choice. The house is much more likely to go up in value, but that's not important to your story. The point is, it's an unexpected twist. I don't know if people remember, there was what was the movie? It's Michael Douglas is in it. It's War of the Roses, I think is called, where it's a couple that's getting divorced. And the whole premise is this basic setup that whoever moves out of the house is going to end up giving it up, which I think is reasonable. And then I think the surprise or the unexpectedness is how far people will go to kind of like, it's obviously taken to the extreme, but it becomes those kinds of things. So thinking about motivation, like why would someone take that car? Or if someone like, oh, she's taking the house, of course she's taking the house, but you find out that's because she plans to sell it and do something completely unexpected, that can be something to play with. Identity, I think, is the fun thing to play with too, which is the idea that maybe a character isn't who they seem to be. And I definitely have tried to do this with quite a few of my books, when you have an unreliable narrator kind of thing, where I'm hopefully setting up where you think someone is a particular way, and then you begin to wonder if maybe they're not. So in You Owe Me a Murder, the basic premise of the story starts out is Kim has, lost her boyfriend, and he's this jerk for having broken up with her, and she's devastated. And then as the story goes on, you're finding out a little bit more about the relationship, and you begin to wonder, is it quite as straightforward as Kim had put it out in the beginning? Or is there maybe a little bit more to it? And certainly that relationship between her and her boyfriend, as it starts to unspool, I'm not saying that Kim was a stalker, because I don't want her to be that, but I did want it to set it up that she had built this relationship into something much more than it was. She was in love with him. She, I think at some level, knew he was not in love with her. So she was willing to see like the fact that they were friends with benefits as a much bigger relationship than it really had been. So when she talks about like, he broke up with me, he did all this stuff, it's kind of like, did he? Or were you guys never really together? And I think that's the element of surprise where I'm hoping that for the reader, the expected thing is like, oh yeah, this was a boyfriend. He's a horrible person. He broke up with her and broke her heart. Of course, these next thing happened, that you start to feel this sense of unease. Christy, you were going to say something and then I cut you off.
Oh, this segues nicely into what I was going to say.
I planned it.
In my sound book, yeah, because it's the return of Billy Rose, who's now Rose, transgendered into this wonderful woman. And a lot of people who sort of started reading the book, they're like, but oh my God, like that's the thing. But that's not the thing. For me, it's almost like the inciting incident. Okay, so Rose is here. She's a gal. And now what happens? And so like the big thing is so not that. And I kind of like that surprise. Yeah.
Yeah, where you set people up to think a certain thing is going to be the expectation, and then you change, like that actually isn't what the story hinges on at all. You take it away from them. And that kind of relates, I think, to the next point that I had to help with surprise, which is perception, which is, I can't remember who talked about sixth sense earlier on, but that's a great example where you're kind of down a certain road and you think a certain thing is happening because you've sort of been set up to believe that, and the character's perception is of that thing. And then you get to see something in a new light and it changes the whole story. And again, this is every single romantic comedy on the planet, where you see one thing, the character interprets it a particular way, and then you set up the element of surprise or unexpectedness, like what you thought was not what it was. Murder mysteries use the exact same thing. You see a clue, you have an idea about what that clue means, but when you put it in conjunction with something else, all of a sudden you see it in a very different way. I think another way to add sort of surprise, the next two are kind of plot things that you may be doing, which is, so the first one that kind of came up was misfortune. So the idea, and this is that thing where, you see that commercial where it's like a bunch of kids in a car and they're laughing and talking, and then all of a sudden it's like this sudden slam and they're hit by another car, and it's a really jarring, surprising kind of thing. But it's the idea of, I have people playing on the beach and all of a sudden one of them is taken down by a shark or a dragon. I'm open. Where it's something that you didn't expect to happen, which is of course often how misfortune tends to be, is you're off doing something. So not when a character is doing something where you're like, oh, this is going to go badly, but something where you've sort of set it up that everything should be fine and then suddenly isn't fine. I was watching a TV show the other day, which was not good, but the interesting setup is they have this very domestic scene happening, and you see the woman and she goes in and she's, fussing with the baby, and it turns out that the baby's died in the middle of the night. So that's going to be the surprise that she's going to unearth. But the scene before that is her all trying to be really quiet and to stop other things from happening so nobody wakes up the baby. And then, of course, the shock is no one's waking up the baby because the baby is actually gone. But I thought that was a way of using misfortune as an element of surprise, because you think the scene is about her keeping everything quiet and someone's going to wake up the baby, and then the rug gets pulled out from under you because you are disappointed and shocked. Here's one that I certainly know nothing about, but work with me here. The idea of betrayal can act as an element of surprise. So if you have someone who believes that the one thing is something, or that they can trust or rely on someone, and you take that away from them, this is basically every episode of Game of Thrones, where there are twists and turns, where allegiances aren't necessarily what they used to be. But betrayal is another way that you can have an element of surprise. So if you have your character and there is someone that they are counting on, whether or not you take that character away from them may be a way of upping the ante and adding an element of surprise. Those, I think, are the biggest ways of doing it. So thinking about how your character looks, thinking about the setting that they're in, thinking about the actions that they take, thinking about their motivations for those actions, thinking about misfortune or betrayal as a way of doing it. That can all happen. And I have also been there, Marianne, where, you think you can really count on someone, and then on an instant you realize you can't. And that changes also your perception of past events and what may have happened. So you realize maybe what I thought was there. And it's also going to change what I do next, because that is going to completely undermine and underpin everything that the character is going to do forward. And I got to give it, I think it was Jenny who had my favorite suggestion, which is the one I think is probably most useful to this, is when you have a character make a action or a decision, or you're going to have them interact with a character, just ask yourself if there's a way to change that up, either in a big way or a small way, that may just be slightly surprising to the character. So if they're going to go into the hospital and the doctor's going to come around the corner, maybe the doctor isn't a white dude. Maybe it's a small Indian woman. That's a small detail, but it just might make the reader go like, oh, I was expecting the typical older white guy with the white coat. The other day I was watching a TV show, and it took place, she drops off her kid at this elementary school, and the teacher comes around the corner, and the teacher is this large black man who's teaching this elementary school classroom. And he's clearly awesome at it. Like, he's great. He's down on the floor with the kids. He's doing all that stuff. But it was just that little bit of unexpectedness, because my initial hunch is, if you say to me, picture an elementary school kindergarten teacher, we all tend to picture either like the young woman or the old lady who's got, the sensible Mary Poppins shoes, who gets down on the floor. So challenging yourself to think outside of that box can be really helpful. Bonnie has the line about characters having their own agenda. And you can play with that quite a bit, because we make assumptions about what people think and why they're doing something, and being surprised by that can sort of jolt someone. Questions, comments, deep thoughts? Christy.
There we go. I was just thinking, there's an ad, and it might be a Geico ad, I'm not sure, but it plays with every scary movie trope. You guys know this one? So the teenagers they're outside at this creepy house, and they're outside in their scanty clothes, and one of them says, "Why don't we just get away in the car that's running?" No, let's run into that creepy, horrible house. No, better still, let's go into the garage with the chainsaws.
Yeah.
So perfect. I just love it. Very unexpected.
Yeah, I think you don't and I think the moment of that ad that I love the best is you see the crazy serial killer who's waiting in the garage, and he like has this moment where he rolls his eyes like he's like, I can't, like, no, can you blame me for killing these people? Like it's not what you expect, because they're taking the tropes that you do expect and heightening them to the point where you recognize how ridiculous or how silly they might seem. So I think that works particularly well. Alyssa.
On the subject of scary things, has anyone seen the movie Wolf Creek? It's set in the Australian outback. Quentin Tarantino says it's the scariest thing he's ever seen. I don't watch scary things, but it starts out as like this kind of like travel movie with like these three friends backpacking, and then they go on a hike and they come back from their hike and their truck won't start. They're in the middle of nowhere, and then so they hitch a ride with this seemingly normal guy, and then horror strikes, and it turns out that this guy has been like damaging hikers' vehicles and then murdering them horribly. And it's all so benign in the movie until it gets horrifying that it is just so shocking. But it plays with your expectations, but it also kind of tricks you because you think it's going to be something that it's not. So I think sometimes that can be done really well, and sometimes it's like, so how do you do that where you're tricking people but you're not pissing them off? I don't know.
I think it's two things. So I think if you're going for the big surprise, so you want something that's going to make people be like, "Wow, I didn't see that coming. I never," like, they have to be able to go back later and be like, "It was there." I mean, that is the moment in Sixth Sense, is as soon as you're like, oh, he's dead. I don't know a single person alive who didn't want to see that movie again right away. I knew some people who walked out of the theater, walked to the line, got in the line, and bought tickets for the very next show because they wanted to watch it again and see it and be like, oh, it was there all the time. The same with Gone Girls. Like, when you realize the twist in that, you're like, okay, now I want to go back and read it again, knowing that I knew those twists. So it has to feel organic, and that you realize like, oh, it was there, I just didn't see it. If it's out of nowhere with nothing connecting it, I think the person is annoyed. I think the small things are different because I think it's just about catching attention. So having the Black elementary school teacher, it's not shocking. It's not like I'm like, what, a Black man teaching elementary school? Like, it's not that. It's just that thing of like, oh, I just didn't expect it at some level. The automatic thing is, again, for me to picture the kind of 20-year-old in the pastel twin set, or the older lady, like, without even thinking about it, that is my thing. So just playing against those stereotypes is enough to kind of twig the reader just that tiny little bit to pay attention. How much you want to pay attention, like if you're doing it like Kindergarten Cop, like that obviously becomes the element of the entire show. If it's a small thing, then I think it's just that thing where it just makes you realize like, oh, that was just a tiny thing out of place. I remember one of the creepiest things that I remember as a kid was going in and seeing that things had been moved around. Like, I don't know if you've ever had that experience, but like, you walk into your house and you're like, I'm almost sure that that little thing used to be on this space and now it's on that space. And I'm pretty sure nobody was in the place to move it. So it becomes that unsettling thing, like, I must have moved it, but maybe not. It's a small thing, but it caught your eye because it is different. Marie, you say yes, but not against genre. Can you describe what you mean by that? Yes. Okay. So yeah, you're not wanting to have a shock where it's like, oh, it looks like it's a historical romance. And then in chapter 10, it turns out that he's Satan and he's actually peeling, babies in the back room. Because that's not shocking. That's cheating. That's lying to the person. So it's around having it be that. So Alyssa mentioned the movie became horror later, but Alyssa, would you say that you knew you had a sense of unease before you got to that point I mean, you knew it was a scary movie because Quentin Tarantino had said it was the scariest movie, but even though it was sort of banal and leading up to that, did you have a sense before that moment?
Yeah, there was definitely that tension of, okay, something's coming. When is something coming? What's going to happen?
And then where it is. So, and looking for how to set that up. So I was reading a student paper. We were doing a critique group last night for SFU, and she's setting up, it's going to be a horror novel, but it was just interesting in terms of she's, you know, setting up, and I'm going to do this clunky because I can't remember her exact example, but she has this group of teenagers who are all having this party out at this riverside kind of thing. But it's just the words she chooses to explain, like the girl's red hair is, and it wasn't this cliche, but blood red. Do you know what I mean? Like she could have chosen to make it fire engine red, but like she chose, and I can't remember what it was, but it just had a darker connotation that I think sets up to the reader something's coming. And then the surprise isn't necessarily as bad. But you don't want to have the surprise. Like I think in Game of Thrones, we were all shocked at the red wedding, but it was consistent with the genre and with the story. So it didn't feel out of place. If we had been watching Kindergarten Cop and the red wedding scene had happened in the middle of that, it would have been definitely shocking, but more than surprising. Like I think surprise is that thing where you're like, oh, I didn't see that coming. Shocking is like, oh, what the holy hell was that? I think that makes the biggest difference. Angela.
I had a real life thing happen on Friday, that just thinking about expectations and setting up expectations. I went to the Giggle Dam in Opoko, and it's like a dinner theater that's sort of a humor, like they do a funny show, and there are about 6 actors up there, and you know that it's audience participation, so we're all trying to hunker down and not be picked. So before it started, one of the actors came to our table, and she was trying to recruit my husband. He said no, and then she said, what about you? I think you'd be good. And I said, oh. And then she said, there's 2 others that are going to join you that I've already asked. And I said, oh, okay, I'll do it. So about an hour later, after we have dinner, somebody taps me on the shoulder. I have to go to the back. They're in the middle of the show, and I'm like, oh, here it is. So they say I'm gonna be part of a 3-headed knight. It was a Camelot twist, and so I get in the middle part. They put this bed sheet over me with 2 heads, and I'm thinking, where's my other 2 partners that they've picked? And it was the 2 actresses. And I was like, oh man, because I think one of the reasons that I agreed to it is because I thought, oh, well, there's 2 other poor sods just like me that are going to be up there and made fun of. But no, it was just me. And so and I know that they purposely did that twist, because I think it's hard to get people to agree to go up to do the audience participation. So there's a real, and for me, I felt calmed. I don't like doing things like that. Because you don't know what they're going to ask you to do. And so it's probably going to be embarrassing. But I sort of felt calm that, okay, but there's going to be 2 people in the audience with me, but they totally misled me. Yeah. So I just think that's an example of,
it's definitely a twist and a surprise. And yeah. I think it's a cheat. I don't think they should have done that to you, but in fiction, I'd love it. In fiction, I love when you set up for the character to do something that maybe they wouldn't do. And then they later realize that they wouldn't. And I Bonnie had put in the chat window, like that's 100% where you see people say they don't like to have dream sequences as an opening, because of course what happens is you think one thing is happening and then it's like, oh, it was just a dream. To the reader, that doesn't feel like a pleasant surprise. That feels like annoying as hell. I think a fun twist for that is if you have something and then basically you're doing the opposite of that, right? Where instead of a boring person who has dreams that they're a spy, like I think the fun twist would be someone who's opening a scene where it's like they're making breakfast or dinner and then they wake up and they realize that they're on a plane about to be dropped out because they're actually a spy. Like that would be a fun way of twisting that trope of waking up from a dream, where instead of like, I'm the ordinary person having this extraordinary dream, is I'm having a boring dream, but I'm actually this extraordinary person who's stuck in that world. I think that would make a very big difference. Yes, Jenny, for those people old enough to remember, and there are a few of us who remember the old Bob Newhart show. In the end, it's like they play with the initial trope of the fact that in his first show, he was a psychologist. And so they kind of take it full circle, and it works really well. So this was my call out, and thanks to Shalon, who had the idea, that I think too often we don't think of surprise unless we're trying to write a thriller or a mystery. But my call out for people is to do a surprise in other stories. So, you know, the other example that Shalon had listed is if you think about, for example, The Fault in Our Stars, when you realize who's actually dying in that, it comes as quite a surprise because you think it's going to be one character and then they switch it up on you and it becomes someone else. So doing something unexpected in your story can be a great element. And if you want to read more about it, Don Moss has a big chapter in his book on writing 21st century fiction. All right. All right, everyone, I'm going to stop recording and send you on your fine way for another Wednesday. Bird's still sleeping on my deck, still breathing, so that's a good sign. I will keep you posted on whether or not it survives. All right. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Eileen.
Bye. And Denise, you have to stay. Sorry, she has after school.